A couple of summers ago, while returning home from a day trip out of town for my son's birthday celebration, we decided to stop by a water park. Afterward, we chose to have dinner in a tiny town. Due to some confusing directions from Google Maps, we got slightly lost but ended up discovering a county fair right across the street. It was getting dark, and the fair was almost over, but we noticed a tractor pull about to begin. Since none of us had ever seen one before, we thought it would be a fun way to wrap up the birthday trip. We found seats on the bleachers and watched for a while. The crowd included many families, but there were also some drunk individuals. I didn't think much of it at the time. I had my 16-year-old son and a good friend with me, so I felt safe. We decided to leave before the event ended, walked back to the now closed restaurant, got into my car, and started our journey home, retracing our steps with Google Maps. As soon as we left the restaurant, I noticed a car behind us. It was the only other car on the road, as most of the town's residents were either at the fair or at home. The car followed us onto a remote, hilly road with wooded areas on both sides. I found it strange, but assumed they might be from out of town too, using the same shortcut to reach the interstate, as summer is a popular time for road trips. Despite feeling uneasy, I focused on getting off that secluded road and onto the interstate as quickly as possible. The sky was fully dark by then, and I was driving cautiously, wary of any deer that might dart across the road. But the car stayed right behind us, even when I slowed down to encourage them to pass. Instead of overtaking us, the driver began tailgating closely. I noticed it was a lone driver in the car with tinted windows. Initially, we were hoping that the car behind us would pass, but no luck. I accelerated, but he matched our speed and stayed uncomfortably close. The interstate was quiet on our side, so I had no option but to keep driving. My friend was furious and ready to confront the guy if needed, but I wanted to avoid a face-to-face encounter, especially with my birthday boy in the back seat. I just kept driving and hoped for no flat tires. At one point, I was scared enough to lay on the horn, hoping the noise would deter him. It worked. He pulled over to the shoulder and turned off his headlights. I felt relieved at first, but it seemed odd that he turned off the lights. We sped up, and for about 15 minutes, everything was calm. We talked about how frightening the situation was and felt relieved to leave it behind us. We were about 25 minutes from home, and with a few other vehicles around, we felt less isolated. However, when the traffic thinned out and we were alone again, something unbelievable happened. The headlights of the car that had been following us burst on again, revealing that he had been tailing us with his lights off, waiting to scare us. I was almost in tears, but anger took over. This guy had been following us for an hour. I saw the taillights of a semi-truck ahead and accelerated quickly. The stranger tried to keep pace with us from the fast lane. Realizing I was trying to catch up with the truck, he performed a dangerous maneuver, swerving into my rear panel to force us off the road. I sped up and narrowly avoided him. I finally reached the semi and stayed close behind it, making it impossible for the stranger to cut us off. The semi-driver must have noticed something was wrong because he swerved into the fast lane, cut off the stranger's car, and tapped his brakes. I took this as my cue to speed ahead and lose the tail. I accelerated to about 90 miles per hour, turned sharply onto a back street leading to a main road, and stopped at a well-lit gas station with a cop present. My friend explained the situation to the officer, who then called for backup to search for the stranger. We left after calling a friend to follow us to a parking lot, where I left my car overnight to avoid the risk of the stranger finding my house. I kept a lookout for that particular model of car for a long time. Thankfully, we made it out safely. What's most troubling is that the small town where this happened is the hometown of one of the largest mental health asylums in the Midwest. This thought has kept me awake on more than one night, and I still check the news for any related stories. Nervously, I sped up, hoping to reach a main road or the interstate soon. But the car stayed on my bumper, matching my speed no matter how fast or slow I went. It became clear that we were being harassed. Fear set in. This was supposed to be a safe and joyful day for my son, and now we were in this terrifying situation. I regretted stopping at the tractor pull, although there was no way I could have foreseen this trouble. After what felt like an eternity, we finally reached the interstate. I hoped the driver was just a local trying to scare out-of-towners, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. My fears were confirmed when the car continued to tailgate us, even on the interstate. This incident happened around 15 years ago, and to this day, just thinking about it sends a chill down my spine. My cousins, my brother and I were incredibly fortunate. My parents owned a timeshare in Laguna Beach, which was a solid 5 to 6 hour drive from our home outside Las Vegas. My cousin and her boyfriend were visiting from Philadelphia, and along with my aunt and grandma, they joined my family, my mom, dad, and brother, for the trip to California. My parents, aunt, and grandma were in one car and had gotten a bit of a head start since my dad is always punctual. Meanwhile, my brother and I were about an hour behind them because my brother was a bit of a slowpoke. Anyway, my cousin's boyfriend was driving, and my brother was in the passenger seat. My cousin and I were in the back, chatting away. It was around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and we were somewhere outside Nipton, California. For those who have been through Nipton, you know it has a creepy vibe. There's a general store with an old bathroom and a restaurant. We were about 10 minutes from Nipton when we saw a car pulled over into the desert. As we drove past, my brother noticed a man lying in the desert. We debated whether to call 911, but realized we had no cell service. This was before smartphones were widespread. I could get a signal if I held my phone just right, so we decided to turn back to check things out. My brother and my cousin's boyfriend got out and started shouting at the man, asking if he was okay. There was no response. As they approached to see if he was dead, my cousin and I spotted 2 people hiding behind the car's trunk. We screamed for them to get back, and they heard the rustling, so they sprinted back to the car. At that moment, the man who was supposedly injured sat up, and 2 intimidating-looking guys appeared. My cousin's boyfriend took off, and we all panicked. I managed to get a signal and called 911 to report what was happening. We drove into Nipton. While I spoke with a dispatcher, said she'd send someone out. I wish that was the end of the story and that we made it to the beach safely, but it's not. We continued on to Baker and decided to stop at the Mad Greek for a bathroom break and some food. As we waited for our order, my cousin's boyfriend came over looking terrified. He pointed outside at the small trading post across the street where we had parked. 3 cars down, guess who pulled in? That's right, the same rough-looking guys. They got out, looked around, and went into the trading post. We quickly grabbed our food to go and tried to figure out how to leave town without getting into trouble. Thankfully, those guys came out carrying beer, and we were relieved that an RV was parked between our SUV and their car. They sped off, and we took that as a sign to get out of there fast. We ran to our car, and we didn't stop until we reached Laguna Beach. I never heard back about the police call, and we never told my parents, aunt, or grandma. To this day, it remains the scariest experience any of us have had, and I refuse to take the Nipton cutoff off route, even if it's a shortcut. Last September, I took a road trip to Myrtle Beach with my family. It was myself, my mother, my sister, her husband, and their 2 kids. We used my car and both my sister's and her husband's cars to transport everything and everyone. We rented a beach house for just over a week and had a great time. I was going through a tough period in my life, struggling with employment and being between jobs, having just started 2 new jobs. I was a bit low on funds and worried about making my car payments, so I decided to head home 2 days early to try and get more hours at work. My family expressed concern as I planned to leave after dinner and drive through the night to get home. I reassured them that I'd be fine staying up all night and that I'd head straight home, only stopping for gas and food as needed. I'm an excellent driver, a bit impatient, so I tend to keep going until I absolutely have to stop and take a break. However, this would be a 12-hour trip, and I knew I would need breaks, so I made a point to stop at every rest area to at least get out and stretch, so I stayed awake and didn't get too sore. As I was going through West Virginia, which you probably know is quite secluded in terms of rest areas and visitor centers, especially when heading north from the south through the mountains, I stopped at a visitor center because it advertised having a fast food place, and I really needed to use the restroom. It was very late at night, around 1 a.m. A side note that sent shivers down my spine after what happened. I like to drive barefoot, so when I pulled in and noticed the fast food places were closed, I drove around the lot and parked under a streetlight in front of the visitor center to use the restroom. While leaning out of my car door, I took my time putting my shoes on to walk inside. After looking around and not seeing anything unusual, I checked my phone and grabbed my wallet before standing up to walk in, making sure my car horn beeped to signal that my doors were locked. Walking toward the center, I saw a man in a white hoodie standing at the edge of the sidewalk leading into the center. I didn't think much of it until I passed him and felt a chill. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him watching me walk in. For some reason, I glanced to my left as I turned back to face forward and noticed another man sitting on a bench on the other side of tall, thin bushes. Instantly, I thought, nope. I went in and used the restroom, and before I walked out, I called my roommate. As silly as it was, because he was about 6 hours away, I just felt safer. I gave him a quick rundown of my situation and asked him to stay on the phone with me. As I started to walk out, I couldn't see the man at the front of the sidewalk anymore. I glanced to my right and saw both men standing next to a bench facing forward. I saw a couple walking in, presumably to use the restroom as well. I had an impulse to ask them to walk with me. My paranoia kicked in because I knew something was wrong somewhere in my situation, and I didn't ask, thinking they might know the men. The men were walking briskly toward my car. I explained to my roommate that the men were by the benches, and with the smallest of peeks over my shoulder again, I saw the man in the white hoodie walking toward me. I told my roommate that the man was following me to my car. I took off. Fortunately, I had a key fob, so I took out my key, unlocked my car, and practically threw myself inside, not daring to look back. I threw my car into reverse and sped backward before shifting into drive and speeding off, not even stopping to put my seatbelt on until I was at the exit to leave the parking lot. I didn't look back. I stopped at the next toll road and filed a report, and the workers called for state troopers to check things out. I couldn't stop shaking for hours and refused to get out of my car until I was home. I terrified myself at the thought of what might have happened if those guys had noticed. If they had made their move more quickly, they could have incapacitated me at my car while I was facing the ground and putting my shoes on, and I would have had absolutely no defense. It was summer, I believe the day after the 4th of July, and my husband and I were in the middle of a cross-country road trip. We were driving through Texas, and for anyone who has driven across the entire state of Texas, you know that it is very long and very barren. Sometimes we'd go hours without seeing anything at all, and the towns we did pass through consisted of little more than a rusty old gas station and a few dusty little houses. Looking out the window, you would swear you were just driving through the same 5 miles of desert over and over again. I had started getting a headache, and my husband suggested I take a quick nap to get rid of it. I remember allowing myself to doze off while watching the beautiful colors of a desert sunset. The slowing of the car woke me up, and the first thing I noticed was how dark it had become. I believe it was around 10 p.m. My husband had stopped at a gas station with a small shop. He told me he was going to grab us some food and asked if I needed to use the restroom, knowing I might not have another chance for quite a while. I went into the shop to use the restroom. Both the men's and women's restrooms were down a little hall from the open area of the shop. I was groggy and tired and realized how badly I needed to pee, so I shuffled into the restroom. As I made my way the short distance from the door to the nearest of the 2 stalls, I made eye contact with a woman coming out of the only other stall. She didn't look quite homeless, but she was definitely messy looking. She had wild gray hair, almost shoulder length, but sticking out in every direction from her head as if it hadn't been brushed in weeks. She was wearing ragged clothing, a pair of ill-fitting black workout shorts, and I remember noting her phone flip-flops. She had several layers on top, one of them being a large purple and green coat. Keep in mind that this is Texas in July. The jacket was just hanging off her shoulders crookedly, as if she hadn't bothered to take a few more seconds to put it on correctly. She was carrying something in a tied-up plastic grocery bag. I gave a quick smile as our eyes met, and she just stared at me and returned the smile. Then her face turned wild and intense looking. Her eyebrows were set as if she were angry, but her eyes had a wild, alive look. She looked at me like she was hungry, and that's when I felt the first tinge of something wrong. I tried to brush it off. She waddled over to the only sink, and I took my time shutting the stall door because something about her posture in front of the mirror struck me as odd, and I was trying to figure it out. She was standing with her body angled more toward me, but her face turned to the mirror. Her body was tense, legs slightly crouched as if she was ready to act. Her hands were not up by her face or trying to fix her mess of hair or even washing them. They were at her sides. Yeah, elbows slightly bent. I wasn't sure why, but I suddenly felt uncomfortable. I regretted leaving my purse and cell phone behind. I shut and locked the stall door and took my time using the toilet, wanting her gone before I left the safety of the stall. I stayed there long after I had finished, but the woman was still there, so I waited longer. Finally, I heard the smacking of her flip-flops as she made her way to the door. I heard it open and then slam closed. The door was pretty heavy and had slammed the same way when I had entered. I stayed for a moment and allowed the wave of relief to wash over me before I reached for the lock, then paused, fingers only an inch from the lock. I stayed as silent as I could to confirm what I had just thought. I heard breathing. The woman had only pretended to leave. At this point, I was scared and confused. Why had she tried to trick me into thinking she had left, only to stick around and be as quiet as possible? I knew something was very wrong, so I stayed in the stall even longer, and this time it must have been at least 20 minutes. But I had no way of knowing for sure. I could tell from the direction her breathing was coming from that she had positioned herself in the far corner, right next to the door, far enough that I couldn't see her feet. Finally, I heard her leave. This time, I waited a few minutes to make sure she hadn't tried her trick again. I slipped out of the stall quickly, washed my hands, and rushed down the hallway to the store. It was pitch black. Outside, I had no idea where she was. She couldn't be far. A large man was checking out at the register, so I waited near a window display until he left the store and quietly slipped out the door behind him. Sure enough, crouched right outside the front door was the woman. She seemed surprised as she stood and turned away, walking quickly around the side of the store. My husband was waiting in the car and asked me if I was okay since I had taken so much longer than usual. I said I would tell him all about it once we were away from that store. The Redditors who previously read about my experience had many theories, but the two most common were that she was a drug user wanting to mug me, or that she was involved in sex trafficking. I'm open to any of your theories. I tried to see if there was anything in the news from around that time, but I couldn't figure out exactly where we were when this happened. When I was younger, each summer and almost every New Year, my family would pack the car and go on a road trip to visit family in Mexico. We never had any problems until one particular trip when I was 8. Like every road trip before, we left our home in North Texas around 6 p.m. to reach our destination the next morning. Around 2 a.m., we crossed into Mexico, and that's when things got weird. When you're on the only stretch of freeway in the middle of the desert, you don't tend to freak out about having the same car behind you for miles. It was practically pitch black outside our car windows, only the dotted stars and the eerie silhouettes of the cacti visible. We had been in Mexico for about an hour and still had a few more hours to drive. I remember sleeping but still being semi-conscious of what was around me, because I didn't have the skill to really fall asleep in a car. When my mother suddenly spoke my dad's name, I heard her say, "Miguel, that car behind us, it's been behind us since we left Laredo." My dad peeked at the car and shrugged off my mother's tension. "A lot of cars use this road. He's probably going to Rosa or another city," he said, and left it at that. Despite his dismissal, my mom kept a wary eye on the car behind us. By this time, my siblings and I were hyper aware of the car and entertained ourselves by watching it through the gaps in the luggage that blocked the rear window. We got tired pretty quickly. "He's getting closer," my mother noted, and we turned to watch as the car inched closer and closer to ours. "He's too close, Miguel," she said, and she was right. By this time, the car was practically pressed against the rear of our car, and on a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere with several more hours until daylight, it was downright scary. We couldn't do much. My dad didn't slow down, didn't stop, and didn't speed away either. He just drove, and the car followed. The next 30 minutes were the most tense we had ever experienced. The car would ease off sometimes, only to press its blinding headlights against our rear once more, as if he knew he was freaking us out and enjoyed it. During one of the periods when the car had pulled away, my mom spotted a police car up ahead, parked on the side of the road. She didn't miss a beat. "Pull over right in front of the police. Pull over right now, Miguel," and he did. The car kept driving. I wonder how confused the policeman must have been as he watched my dad park our car right in front of him. The policeman came over and asked what was wrong, and my mother urgently told him everything. Car, the way it followed, and how it taunted us. The policeman took her claim seriously and told us how people were victimized and had their cars stolen on these empty highways by thugs and criminals. He then offered to drive behind us for a while to make us feel safe. We drove off with the police cruiser behind us, relieved, until about 10 minutes later when we saw something that confirmed the policeman's words and my mother's worst fears. We saw the car pulled over on the side of the road, waiting. I lived in New Mexico for several years before moving to the Midwest. My friend Amy and I would spend many days exploring the remote corners of New Mexico, discovering abandoned ghost towns and enjoying the quiet, desolate beauty of the desert. One afternoon in March 2010, we were traveling from Ruidoso to Albuquerque. Always up for exploring, we took a back road rather than traveling the more direct highway. One leg of our journey had us on NM 55, a remote, tiny 2-lane highway. We love those types of roads. Up until that day, this part of New Mexico was flat and desolate desert. You could see for miles. There was virtually nothing except dirt and rock between towns. We were on NM 55, going north. After a few minutes, we saw a white pickup truck up ahead of us going in the same direction. Suddenly, he stopped his truck sideways in the middle of the highway, blocking both lanes. We were about a mile away from him, and as we got closer, we began to feel uneasy. There seemed to be no reason for him to do this. We were the only other vehicle out there, and we started wondering if we should turn around rather than approach him and have to stop. We were about half a mile away when he pulled over to the opposite side of the highway, but his truck was still pointed in the direction we were going. We tried to relax a little. Surely this guy was a rancher or something. Maybe he was checking something on his land. As we passed him, we noticed a few things. There was only one person in the truck, a middle-aged man who never took his eyes off us, and he was talking into a walkie-talkie. A few seconds after we passed him, he pulled back onto the highway and started following us. However, he never got too close. He would get within a few car lengths and then drop back a little, only to speed back up again to within a few car lengths. We were getting nervous. We realized how alone we really were. We had seen no other traffic on that road, and hadn't told anyone about our decision to take this detour. We checked our phones, but neither had a signal, typical for remote New Mexico, scary given our present situation. Amy was driving and speeding up while I frantically checked the map, hoping to find a road with more traffic. There was no other road. We had to travel this one to get to the next town. Turning around to go back didn't seem like a good option. After a few minutes, we saw another pickup truck coming towards us. It was going very, very slowly, maybe 20 miles per hour if that. This pickup was old and beat up, whereas the one behind us was newer. Amy had us up to 75 miles per hour, and we blew by the old pickup. As we passed it, we saw that it was another middle-aged man, and he was talking into a walkie-talkie. After the white pickup truck passed him, he made a U-turn and pulled in behind it. As we watched all this, we could see the white pickup truck driver talking into his walkie-talkie. No doubt these two knew each other. We were being deliberately followed, and for the first and only time in my life, I felt hunted. They stayed right behind us. We watched for obstacles on the road and truly thought that the old, beat-up pickup truck guy had set up a trap and that our vehicle would be disabled somehow. We talked about driving into the fields, but this was obviously their territory, and we were afraid of what would happen if we went off-road and got cornered. So, we stayed on the highway. By now, the white pickup truck guy was right on top of us. We could see him talking into the walkie-talkie, and he stayed right on our bumper. The old, beat-up pickup truck guy was right on top of him. The three of us sped down the highway. The white pickup inched closer. His maneuvering and edging closer made it apparent that he was trying to bump us. I watched helplessly as he got within inches of our back bumper. Amy floored it. We were passing 80 miles per hour and edging up to 90. The road was flat and deserted, but any little thing going wrong would have been catastrophic. We absolutely were not going to slow down or stop if we could help it. The white pickup truck pulled into the opposite lane and started to gain speed. The only thing we could think of was that he wanted to pass us and get in front of us. If he got in front of us and his buddy was behind us, we'd be boxed in and trapped. We looked frantically at the rocky desert on both sides of us. Our only option was to go off-road. Should we risk it? Could we speed through the desert and make it to safety in one piece? As we topped a small incline, we saw a sign that said Salina Pueblo Missions National Monument and pointed towards a road on the left. Right at that moment, a blue pickup truck pulled out from that road and onto the highway in front of us. As we came up on the blue pickup, we saw that its plate said U.S. Park Service. We looked at each other and then looked behind us. Both pickup trucks did U-turns and went the other way. We followed the blue pickup to Mountain Air and then made our way to Albuquerque. I don't know exactly what those guys' intentions were, but they weren't good. There is something seriously wrong out there. I notified the state police and they said they would keep an eye on things. This area is very near Belen, New Mexico, which is where Tara Calico was abducted. It's also about 100 miles from Elephant Butte, which is where David Parker Ray had his secret torture laboratory. We didn't put all that together until later. Even though David Parker Ray had died by the time this happened to us, we believe there are others out there like him. Whoever abducted Tara has never been caught. Or maybe we came into meth lab territory. Since this happened on an actual highway rather than a backcountry road, I tend to discount the meth lab theory. Whatever is going on out there, it's not good.